The bustling American shopping mall teemed with activity as Mike, a security guard, commenced his shift. His keen eyes scanned the crowd, a mix of families pushing strollers, teenagers hanging out in groups, and adults rushing between stores. Mike's posture was rigid, his gaze alert, constantly assessing potential threats to the mall's safety and order. As he patrolled the wide corridors, Mike's mind wandered to his daughter, Emma. At 15, she was growing into a young woman, and the challenges of raising her alone weighed heavily on him. His ex-wife had left years ago, leaving him to navigate the complexities of single parenthood while maintaining a full-time job. Mike's salary as a security guard barely covered their expenses. The modest apartment they shared often felt cramped, and he struggled to provide Emma with the things her peers took for granted. Despite the financial strain, he was determined to give her a stable life and a shot at a better future. His radio crackled, bringing him back to the present. A colleague reported a group of rowdy teenagers near the food court. Mike headed there, his steps quick and purposeful. He dispersed the group with a stern warning, feeling a twinge of guilt as he recognized one of Emma's classmates among them. As the afternoon wore on, Mike's vigilance never wavered. He assisted a lost child, dealt with a shoplifter, and helped an elderly woman who had fallen near the escalator. Each incident reinforced his belief in the importance of his job, even if others saw him as just another uniformed figure in the background. It was during a quieter moment that Mike first noticed Marcus. The man entered the mall through the main doors, dressed in jeans and a casual button-down shirt. Something about him immediately caught Mike's attention. Maybe it was the way Marcus looked around, seemingly taking in every detail of the place. Or perhaps it was simply the color of his skin, a thought Mike pushed away as quickly as it formed. Without conscious thought, Mike began to follow Marcus at a distance. He watched as the man window shopped, occasionally entering stores, but never making a purchase. To Mike's trained eye, this behavior seemed suspicious. He'd seen shoplifters use similar tactics to case potential targets. As Marcus approached a high-end electronics store, Mike decided to intervene. He quickened his pace, closing the distance between them. "Excuse me, sir," he called out, his voice authoritative. Marcus turned, surprise evident on his face. Mike's approach was aggressive from the start. "I'm going to need you to come with me," he said, reaching for Marcus's arm. Confusion turned to anger on Marcus's face as he pulled away from Mike's grasp. "What's this about?" Marcus demanded, his voice rising. "I haven't done anything wrong." By now, other shoppers had stopped to watch the confrontation. Mike could feel their eyes on him, but he pressed on, convinced he was doing his job. "Sir, your behavior has been deemed suspicious. I'm asking you to leave the premises immediately." Marcus's protests grew louder. "This is ridiculous. You can't just kick me out for no reason." He reached into his pocket, perhaps for identification, but Mike misinterpreted the action. In a flash, he had Marcus's arm twisted behind his back, marching him towards the exit. The scene was chaotic. Onlookers pulled out their phones, recording the incident. Some shouted at Mike to stop, while others urged Marcus to comply. Through it all, Mike remained stone-faced, focused on what he believed was his duty. As they reached the doors, Marcus made one last attempt to explain. "You don't understand," he began, but Mike cut him off. "Save it," Mike growled, giving Marcus a final push through the doors. "Don't come back, or I'll have you arrested for trespassing." As the doors closed behind Marcus, Mike turned to face the crowd that had gathered. He could see the mix of shock, anger, and confusion on their faces. For a moment, doubt crept into his mind. Had he overreacted? But he pushed the thought away, telling himself he had done what was necessary to protect the mall and its patrons. Little did Mike know that his actions that day would set in motion a chain of events that would challenge everything he thought he knew about himself, his job, and the world around him. As he returned to his patrol, the first whispers of what had just transpired were already spreading through the mall and beyond, like ripples in a pond, growing larger and more significant with each passing moment. Marcus stumbled out of the mall, his face flushed with a mix of anger and humiliation. The sudden brightness of the afternoon sun did nothing to alleviate the darkness of his mood. He stood there for a moment, trying to process what had just happened, his hands shaking slightly as he reached for his phone. As he unlocked the screen, a flood of notifications poured in. Messages from friends, colleagues, and even strangers began to fill his inbox. At first, Marcus was confused by the sudden influx of communication, but as he started to read, the reality of the situation began to sink in. "Just saw the video. Are you okay?" One message read. "This is outrageous. We're here for you, Marcus," said another. "Can't believe this is still happening in 2024. Justice for Marcus." Marcus's eyes widened as he realized that someone had recorded the incident and shared it online. The video was spreading rapidly across social media platforms, sparking outrage and calls for action. He watched a portion of the clip, wincing as he saw himself being manhandled and pushed out of the mall he owned. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on Marcus. He had worked tirelessly for years to build his business empire, culminating in the purchase of this very mall. It was meant to be a symbol of progress, a testament to what could be achieved through hard work and determination. Now, it had become the stage for a very public display of the racism he had fought against his entire life. As Marcus scrolled through the comments and messages, he felt a complex mix of emotions. There was anger at the security guard who had profiled and humiliated him. There was gratitude for the outpouring of support from the community. But most of all, there was a deep, aching sadness that despite all his accomplishments, he could still be reduced to nothing more than the color of his skin in the eyes of some. The hashtag, #CheshireJusticeForMarcus, was gaining traction with each passing minute. People were sharing their own experiences of racial profiling, calling for the security guard's termination and demanding changes in the mall's policies. Marcus watched as his personal experience transformed into a rallying cry for a larger movement. Feeling overwhelmed, Marcus decided to head home. As he drove, his phone continued to buzz incessantly with notifications. News outlets were reaching out for comments, civil rights organizations were offering support, and local community leaders were expressing their solidarity. Once home, Marcus sat heavily on his couch, the weight of the day pressing down on him. He turned on the TV, only to see his own face staring back at him from the local news. The anchor was discussing the incident, showing clips from the viral video and interviewing eyewitnesses. The victim, identified as Marcus Johnson, was forcibly removed from the premises by a security guard who allegedly profiled him based on his race, the anchor reported. The incident has sparked outrage in the community and reignited discussions about racial bias in public spaces. Marcus muted the TV, unable to bear hearing more about the incident. He picked up his phone again, this time to call his lawyer. As he waited for the call to connect, he caught sight of his reflection in a nearby mirror. The successful businessman, the community leader, the mall owner. None of that was visible in that moment. All he saw was a man who had been judged and found wanting based solely on the color of his skin. The conversation with his lawyer was brief but productive. They agreed to release a statement the following day and to explore legal options against the mall's security company. As Marcus ended the call, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. This incident, as painful as it was, could be a catalyst for change. He opened his laptop and began drafting a statement. In it, he would reveal his identity as the mall's owner, share his experiences as a black man in America, and outline his plans to address racial bias in his businesses and the wider community. It wouldn't be easy, but Marcus was determined to turn this moment of personal humiliation into an opportunity for education and growth. As the evening wore on, Marcus's phone continued to buzz with messages of support and media requests. The hashtag Justice for Marcus had evolved into We Stand with Marcus, trending nationally. People were organizing protests outside the mall for the following day, demanding accountability and change. Marcus leaned back in his chair, exhausted but resolute. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for now, he allowed himself to feel the support of the community rallying around him. The incident had laid bare the persistent reality of racial profiling, but it had also revealed the strength of those willing to stand against it. As he prepared for bed, Marcus's thoughts turned to the security guard who had expelled him. He wondered about the man's background, his motivations, his own struggles. While Marcus couldn't excuse the guard's actions, he recognized that lasting change would require understanding and addressing the root causes of such behavior. With a deep sigh, Marcus set his alarm for an early start. Tomorrow would be a day of reckoning, not just for the mall and its employees, but for a community grappling with its own biases and the long shadow of systemic racism. As he drifted off to sleep, Marcus held on to hope. Hope that from this painful experience, real and lasting change might emerge. The local news station studio buzzed with activity as Marcus sat under the bright lights, facing a reporter. The interview had been hastily arranged in response to the viral incident at the mall. Marcus, composed but with a hint of weariness in his eyes, adjusted his tie as the reporter began. "Mr. Johnson, thank you for joining us. Can you walk us through what happened yesterday at Greenview Mall?" Marcus nodded, his voice steady as he recounted the events. "I entered the mall, as I've done countless times before, to oversee some ongoing renovations. Before I knew it, I was being confronted by a security guard who accused me of suspicious behavior. Despite my attempts to explain, I was forcibly removed from the premises." The reporter leaned forward, her expression a mix of concern and curiosity. "As a successful businessman and the owner of the mall, how did this incident make you feel?" Marcus paused, choosing his words carefully. "Humiliated, angry, but mostly I felt a deep sadness. This incident is a stark reminder that no matter our achievements, many of us are still judged by the color of our skin rather than the content of our character." He went on to share his journey as a black man in the business world, the obstacles he'd overcome, and the persistent discrimination he'd faced. What happened yesterday isn't an isolated incident. It's a symptom of a larger problem that many people of color face daily. As the interview continued, Marcus emphasized the need for systemic change. "We need better training, more diverse hiring practices, and a real commitment to addressing implicit biases. This isn't just about one security guard or one mall. It's about creating a society where everyone feels safe and respected." Meanwhile, across town, Mike sat at his kitchen table, his head in his hands. The TV in the background was tuned to the local news, Marcus's interview serving as a painful reminder of yesterday's events. Mike's daughter, Emma, sat across from him, her face a mask of disappointment and anger. "Dad, how could you do that?" Emma's voice was filled with disbelief. "Do you realize how this makes you look? How it makes us look?" Mike looked up, his face haggard from a sleepless night. "Emma, you have to understand. I was just doing my job. I saw what I thought was suspicious behavior, and I acted on it." Emma's eyes flashed with frustration. "But that's the problem, Dad. You saw a black man and automatically assumed he was suspicious. Do you know how racist that is?" The word racist hit Mike like a physical blow. He'd always prided himself on treating everyone equally, on being one of the good guys. But now, faced with his daughter's accusation and the public backlash, he was forced to confront his own biases. "I'm not a racist, Emma," Mike protested weakly. "I have black friends. I've never used racial slurs." Emma shook her head, her voice softening slightly. Dad, racism isn't just about using slurs or actively hating people. It's about the assumptions we make, the unconscious biases we carry. What you did yesterday, that's racism in action. As Emma's words sank in, Mike felt a mix of shame and defensiveness. He wanted to argue, to explain himself, but deep down, he knew his daughter was right. He'd acted on an assumption, a split-second judgment based on nothing more than appearance. "I don't know what to do, Emma," Mike admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I could lose my job over this. How will we manage if that happens?" Emma's expression softened further. Despite her anger, she could see the fear and uncertainty in her father's eyes. "I don't know, Dad, but we'll figure it out. What's important now is that you recognize what you did wrong and try to make it right." As the weight of the situation settled over them, Mike's phone buzzed. It was a message from his friend and fellow security guard, Tom. "Hey Mike, saw the news. Tough break, man. Want to grab a beer and talk?" Mike hesitated, then replied affirmatively. He needed to talk to someone who might understand his perspective, someone who knew the pressures of the job. An hour later, Mike sat across from Tom in a dimly lit bar, nursing a beer. The TV above the bar was replaying clips from Marcus's interview, prompting sideways glances from other patrons who recognized Mike. "I don't know what to do, Tom," Mike confessed, his voice low. "I was just trying to do my job, keep them all safe. Now everyone's calling me a racist, and I might lose everything." Tom nodded sympathetically. "It's a tough situation, Mike. But you gotta ask yourself, would you have reacted the same way if it was a white guy walking around the mall?" Mike opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. He wanted to say yes, that he would have treated anyone acting suspiciously the same way. But he wasn't sure if that was true, and the realization unsettled him. As they continued to talk, Mike began to see the incident from a different perspective. He thought about the times he'd been followed in stores, the suspicious looks he'd received simply for being in certain neighborhoods. He'd always brushed those experiences off, but now he wondered if that's how Marcus had felt. The conversation with Tom left Mike with more questions than answers, but it also sparked a determination to understand and do better. As he headed home, Mike knew that the road ahead would be difficult, but he was committed to confronting his biases and working to change, not just for his job, but for his daughter and for himself. The conference room of Greenview Mall buzzed with tension as the management team gathered for an emergency meeting. The large oak table was surrounded by anxious faces, each person acutely aware of the crisis unfolding around them. At the head of the table sat Sarah Thompson, the mall's general manager, her usually composed demeanor showing signs of strain. "All right, everyone," Sarah began, her voice cutting through the murmur of conversation. "I think we all know why we're here. The incident with our security guard, Mike and Mr. Johnson, has exploded into a PR nightmare. We need to decide on our course of action, and we need to do it now." The room fell silent as Sarah's words sank in. Then, as if a dam had broken, everyone started speaking at once. "We can't just sit back and do nothing," asserted James, the marketing director. "The longer we wait, the worse this gets. We need to release a statement condemning Mike's actions and affirming our commitment to diversity and inclusion." Lisa, the head of human resources, shook her head. "It's not that simple, James. Mike has been with us for over a decade. He's never had any complaints against him before. We can't just throw him under the bus without due process." "Due process?" scoffed Tyler, the youngest member of the team and head of digital operations. "Have you seen social media? People are calling for boycotts. We're hemorrhaging goodwill by the minute. We need to act decisively." The debate continued, voices rising and falling as each department head argued their position. Some advocated for Mike's immediate termination, while others pushed for a more measured approach. The tension in the room was palpable, mirroring the charged atmosphere outside the mall's walls where protesters had begun to gather. As the argument reached a fever pitch, Sarah raised her hand, silencing the room. "Okay, I think we need to take a step back and look at the bigger picture. This isn't just about Mike or Mr. Johnson. It's about our values as an organization and how we respond to crises." She turned to Lisa. "Lisa, you mentioned Mike's clean record, but have we ever evaluated our security team's approach to potential threats? Have we provided any training on racial bias?" Lisa shifted uncomfortably. "We've had general diversity training, but nothing specific to security operations. It's something we should have considered." Sarah nodded, then addressed the room. "I think that's our first step. We need to acknowledge that this incident, while carried out by one individual, reflects a systemic issue we've failed to address." James leaned forward, his marketing instincts kicking in. "What if we organize an event, something to promote inclusion and diversity? We could invite community leaders, have workshops, make a real show of our commitment to change." The suggestion sparked a new round of discussion, this time more constructive. Ideas flew back and forth: sensitivity training for all staff, a review of hiring practices, partnerships with local civil rights organizations. As the conversation progressed, a sense of purpose began to replace the earlier panic. The team started to see the crisis not just as a threat, but as an opportunity for meaningful change. Then, just as they were starting to feel like they were making progress, the door opened. All heads turned to see Robert, the mall's legal counsel, enter the room. His face was grave. "I'm sorry to interrupt," Robert said, his voice somber. "But there's something you all need to know. I've just received some information that changes everything." The room fell silent, all eyes on Robert as he took a deep breath. "Marcus Johnson, the man who was removed from the mall. He's not just any customer. He's the owner of Greenview Mall." The revelation hit the room like a thunderbolt. Gasps and exclamations of shock echoed off the walls. Sarah, who had maintained her composure throughout the meeting, visibly paled. How is this possible?" she stammered. "Why weren't we informed?" Robert shook his head. "It seems Mr. Johnson prefers to keep a low profile. He acquired the mall through a holding company 6 months ago. Only a few people at the corporate level were aware." The implications of this new information began to sink in. What had seemed like a serious but manageable crisis now took on catastrophic proportions. They hadn't just racially profiled a customer. They had humiliated and forcibly removed the very man who owned the building they were sitting in. As the team grappled with this new reality, Sarah stood up, her face set with determination. "Okay, this changes things, but it doesn't change everything. We still need to address the underlying issues. But now, we also need to prepare for potential major changes in leadership and direction." She looked around the room, meeting each person's eyes. "We have a lot of work to do, and not much time to do it. Let's get started." As the meeting adjourned and the team dispersed, each person felt the weight of the task ahead. They knew that the coming days and weeks would be challenging, but also that they had an opportunity to turn this crisis into a catalyst for real, lasting change. The future of Greenview Mall hung in the balance, and it was up to them to chart its course. The atmosphere in the executive boardroom was tense as Marcus Johnson entered, his presence commanding immediate attention. The mall's management team, still reeling from the revelation of his true identity, stood nervously as he took his seat at the head of the table. Marcus surveyed the room, his expression impassive. "Good morning," he began, his voice calm but firm. "I think we all know why we're here. What happened 2 days ago was more than just an isolated incident. It's symptomatic of a larger issue that needs to be addressed." Sarah Thompson, the mall's general manager, leaned forward. "Mr. Johnson, on behalf of the entire team, I want to express our deepest apologies for what happened. We're committed to making this right." Marcus nodded, acknowledging her words. I appreciate that, Sarah. But apologies, while necessary, are not sufficient. I'm here today because I want to see real, tangible changes in how this mall operates. He pulled out a folder and laid it on the table. I've reviewed our policies, our hiring practices, and our training programs. To be blunt, they're woefully inadequate when it comes to addressing issues of diversity and racial bias. The management team exchanged uneasy glances as Marcus continued. From this point forward, we're going to implement comprehensive diversity and inclusion training for all staff, from the janitorial team to senior management. We're going to review and revise our hiring practices to ensure we're building a team that reflects the diversity of our community. He turned to Lisa from HR. I want a complete overhaul of our security protocols. Our guards need better training on how to approach and interact with customers without relying on racial stereotypes. Lisa nodded, frantically taking notes. Yes, sir. We'll get started on that right away. Marcus then addressed James from marketing. We need to rebuild trust with our community. I want proposals for community outreach programs, partnerships with local minority-owned businesses, and initiatives to make the mall a more inclusive space for everyone. As Marcus outlined his vision for change, the tension in the room began to shift. Initial nervousness gave way to a sense of purpose as the team realized that this crisis could be a turning point for the mall. Meanwhile, across town, Mike stood nervously in front of a podium, cameras flashing, as he prepared to make a public statement. The mall's PR team had organized this press conference as part of their damage control efforts, and Mike had agreed to speak, hoping to explain his actions and apologize. Good morning, Mike began, his voice shaky. I'm here today to address my actions 2 days ago at Greenview Mall. I want to start by saying, unequivocally, that I was wrong. My actions were based on unfounded suspicions and unconscious biases that I'm only now beginning to recognize and confront. He paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. I've spent the last 2 days reflecting on what happened, talking with my family, and educating myself about the realities of racial profiling. I now understand that my actions were part of a larger systemic problem, one that causes pain and injustice to people of color every day. As Mike spoke, his daughter Emma watched from the sidelines, her expression a mix of pride and concern. She could see the toll this ordeal had taken on her father, but also the genuine remorse and desire to change that motivated his words. I know that words alone are not enough, Mike continued. That's why I've decided to enroll in intensive bias training and to volunteer with local organizations that work to combat racial injustice. I'm committed to learning, growing, and becoming part of the solution rather than part of the problem. As Mike finished his statement and began taking questions from reporters, the scene shifted back to Marcus's office at the mall. He sat at his desk, watching Mike's press conference on a tablet. His expression was thoughtful as he listened to the security guard's apology and commitment to change. Marcus's assistant knocked on the door. Sir, the management team is ready with their initial proposals for the changes you requested. Marcus nodded, turning off the tablet. Send them in. As the team filed into his office, Marcus felt a mix of emotions. There was still anger and hurt from the incident, but also a glimmer of hope. He saw an opportunity not just to change policies at the mall, but to spark a broader conversation about racial bias in their community. All right, Marcus said, as the last person took their seat. Let's see what you've come up with. Remember, we're not just fixing a PR problem here. We're aiming for real, lasting change. As the meeting began, Marcus knew that the road ahead would be challenging. Changing ingrained behaviors and systemic biases wouldn't happen overnight. But as he listened to the team's ideas and suggestions, he felt a growing sense of determination. This painful incident could be the catalyst for something positive, a chance to create a more inclusive and equitable environment, not just at the mall, but in the wider community. The community center's main hall was packed to capacity, a diverse crowd filling every available seat. The air buzzed with anticipation as people waited for the event to begin. Banners proclaiming unity in diversity and building a better community together hung from the walls, setting the tone for what was to come. On the stage, Marcus Johnson stood at the podium, surveying the audience. He saw faces of all colors, ages, and backgrounds, a true representation of the community he hoped to impact. Taking a deep breath, he began to speak. "Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming out tonight," Marcus started, his voice steady and clear. "We're here because 2 weeks ago, an incident occurred at Greenview Mall that shook our community. But we're also here because that incident has given us an opportunity to confront the biases that exist in our society and to work together to create real change." As Marcus spoke about his experience and the broader issues of racial profiling and discrimination, the audience listened intently. Some nodded in agreement. Others wiped away tears as they related to the pain and frustration in his words. "But this isn't just about me," Marcus continued. "It's about every person of color who's been followed in a store, every woman who's been patronized in a business meeting, every individual who's been judged based on their appearance rather than their character. Tonight, we start the work of building a community where everyone feels valued, respected, and safe." As Marcus concluded his speech, the applause was thunderous. The energy in the room was palpable, a mix of determination, hope, and a collective desire for change. Next on the agenda was Mike, the security guard at the center of the incident. As he approached the podium, the room fell silent. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Mike's hands shook slightly as he adjusted the microphone. I want to start by apologizing again," he began, his voice wavering. "What I did was wrong, and I'm here today not to make excuses, but to take responsibility for my actions and to commit to doing better." He went on to share what he had learned over the past 2 weeks, about implicit bias, about the daily realities faced by people of color, about the need for constant vigilance against one's own prejudices. As he spoke, the initial hostility in the room began to soften, replaced by a cautious openness. "I know I can't undo what I did," Mike concluded, "but I can promise to work every day to be part of the solution. I'm grateful for this chance to learn and grow, and I'm committed to helping create a community where what happened to Mr. Johnson never happens to anyone else." As Mike stepped back from the podium, there was a moment of silence, then a smattering of applause that grew stronger. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was acknowledgement of his effort, his sincerity, and the difficult journey of change he was undertaking. The event continued with panel discussions, workshops, and community dialogues. People shared their experiences, listened to different perspectives, and worked together to brainstorm solutions. Ideas flowed freely, from revamping school curricula to include more diverse voices, to creating community policing initiatives, to establishing mentorship programs for minority youth. As the evening wore on, the initial tension in the room gave way to a sense of shared purpose. People who had entered as strangers were now exchanging contact information, making plans to continue the conversations and work they had started. However, not everyone was ready to embrace the spirit of reconciliation. A small group of protesters gathered outside the community center, holding signs that criticized what they saw as political correctness gone too far, and defending Mike's original actions as justified. Inside, Marcus noticed the commotion and felt a familiar weight settle in his chest. He knew that change wouldn't come easily or quickly, that there would always be resistance and setbacks. But as he looked around the room at the engaged faces and animated discussions, he felt a spark of hope. As the event came to a close, Marcus took the stage one last time. "This is just the beginning," he said, his voice filled with determination. The real work starts tomorrow, when we leave this room and begin to apply what we've learned in our daily lives. It won't be easy, but if we commit to this journey together, I believe we can create the kind of community we all want to live in. The applause that followed was not just a polite acknowledgement, but a collective promise, a commitment to the challenging but necessary work ahead. As people filed out of the hall, there was a sense that something had shifted. The incident at the mall had been a catalyst, but what would come next would be determined by the actions of every person in that room and beyond. Marcus watched as the crowd dispersed, feeling both exhausted and invigorated. He knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult, but for the first time since the incident, he felt genuinely optimistic about the future. The community had taken its first steps toward healing and change, and Marcus was determined to see it through. The sun beat down on the crowd gathered in front of Greenview Mall. Hundreds of people had assembled, holding signs and chanting slogans demanding justice and change. The protest, organized by local activist groups, had drawn a diverse crowd, young and old, representing various races and backgrounds. Among the protesters was Emma, Mike's daughter. She stood with a group of her high school friends, holding a sign that read, "Confront bias, embrace diversity." The past few weeks had been a whirlwind of emotions for Emma. She had grappled with disappointment in her father's actions, anger at the systemic racism the incident had exposed, and a growing determination to be part of the solution. As Emma chanted along with the crowd, she caught sight of her father watching from the sidelines. Mike stood at the edge of the mall's property, his security guard uniform replaced by civilian clothes. His face was a mixture of shame and pride, shame for his past actions, and pride in seeing his daughter take a stand for what was right. Emma's friend Zoe noticed Mike as well. "Hey, isn't that your dad?" she asked, her voice tinged with curiosity and a hint of judgment. Emma nodded. "Yeah, it is. He's trying to understand, to be better." The conversation was cut short as the crowd's energy surged. Marcus Johnson had arrived, stepping up to a makeshift podium to address the protesters. "Thank you all for being here today," Marcus began, his voice amplified by a portable speaker system. "Your presence sends a powerful message that our community will not tolerate discrimination in any form." As Marcus spoke about the changes being implemented at the mall and his vision for a more inclusive community, Emma found herself moved by his words. She realized that this wasn't just about her father, or even just about the mall. It was about creating a society where everyone could feel safe and respected. Meanwhile, Mike watched from afar, his emotions in turmoil. Seeing his daughter among the protesters filled him with a complex mix of emotions: pride in her conviction, shame for his own actions, and a deepening understanding of the impact of systemic racism. As the protest continued, Mike made a decision. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number he had been given, but had been too afraid to use. "Hello, Mr. Johnson. This is Mike, the security guard from the incident. I was wondering if we could talk." There was a pause on the other end of the line, long enough for Mike to wonder if he had made a mistake. Then, Marcus's voice came through, cautious but not unkind. "Hello, Mike. I appreciate you reaching out, but I think we both need some more time to process everything that's happened." Mike's heart sank, but he understood. "I get it. I just wanted to say, I'm sorry, really sorry, and I'm committed to doing better, to learning and changing." "I believe you, Mike," Marcus replied, his tone softening slightly. "But change takes time and consistent effort. Keep doing the work, and maybe we can talk again in the future." As the call ended, Mike felt a mix of disappointment and determination. He knew he had a long road ahead, but he was committed to walking it. Back in the crowd, Emma continued to chant and march with her friends. As the protest wound down, she saw her father still standing at the edge of the property. After a moment's hesitation, she walked over to him. "Hey, Dad," she said, her voice a mix of warmth and residual disappointment. "Hey, sweetie," Mike replied, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm proud of you, you know that?" Emma nodded, then asked, "Are you okay?" Mike took a deep breath. I'm working on it. This isn't easy, but I'm trying to learn, to be better." Emma reached out and squeezed her father's hand. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start. As the crowd dispersed, the mall's management team gathered inside to discuss the protest and its implications. Sarah, the general manager, looked around the table. "All right, team, we've made some changes, but clearly, our community is expecting more. We need to show that we're serious about addressing these issues. Any ideas?" The room buzzed with suggestions: diversity hiring initiatives, community outreach programs, partnerships with local civil rights organizations. As they talked, it became clear that the incident with Mike and Marcus had sparked a much larger conversation, one that would continue to shape the mall and the community for a long time to come. Outside, as the last of the protesters left, Marcus stood looking at the mall. He knew that real change would take time, effort, and persistence. But as he watched the diverse group of people who had come together to demand justice and equality, he felt a glimmer of hope. The incident that had started as a personal humiliation was turning into a catalyst for community-wide change. And Marcus was determined to see that change through, no matter how long it took. The small cafe bustled with the afternoon crowd, the aroma of coffee mingling with the low hum of conversations. In a corner booth, Mike sat nervously, his fingers drumming an erratic rhythm on the tabletop. He checked his watch for the 5th time in as many minutes, his anxiety growing with each passing second. The bell above the door chimed, and Mike's head snapped up. Marcus Johnson walked in, his presence commanding attention even in the busy cafe. As he made his way to the booth, Mike stood, wiping his palms on his jeans. "Mr. Johnson," Mike began, his voice shaky. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me." Marcus nodded, his face neutral as he took his seat. "Mike, I appreciate you reaching out, but I hope you understand that this isn't going to be an easy conversation." Mike swallowed hard and nodded. "I know, and I'm ready for that. I need to face what I did and the consequences of my actions." As they ordered their coffee, an uncomfortable silence settled between them. Marcus studied Mike, noting the dark circles under his eyes and the nervous energy radiating from him. It was clear that the past few weeks had taken their toll. Once their drinks arrived, Marcus leaned forward. "All right, Mike, you wanted to talk, so talk. Explain to me why you did what you did that day." Mike took a deep breath, his hands wrapped tightly around his coffee mug. "I've been asking myself that same question every day since it happened, and the truth is, there's no good explanation. I acted on instinct, on biases I didn't even realize I had." He paused, struggling to find the right words. "I've been a security guard for 15 years. I've always prided myself on keeping people safe, on doing my job well. But that day, I failed. I failed you. I failed the community, and I failed myself." Marcus listened intently, his expression unreadable. When Mike finished, Marcus spoke, his voice calm but firm. "You're right, you did fail. But what I want to know is, what are you going to do about it now?" Mike straightened up, a determined look crossing his face. "I'm committed to changing. I've been attending bias training sessions, reading books about systemic racism, really trying to understand the experiences of people of color. I know it's not enough, that it's just a start, but I'm dedicated to this journey." As Mike spoke about his efforts to educate himself and change his perspective, Marcus found himself grudgingly impressed by the man's sincerity. It would have been easier for Mike to get defensive, to make excuses. Instead, he was owning his mistakes and actively working to be better. The conversation continued, delving into deeper, more uncomfortable topics. They discussed the daily realities of being a black man in America, the weight of constantly being viewed with suspicion, the exhaustion of having to prove oneself over and over again. For Mike, it was an eye-opening experience. He found himself confronting uncomfortable truths about his own privilege and the unconscious biases he had carried for years. "I never realized," he said at one point, his voice barely above a whisper. I knew racism existed, but I didn't understand how pervasive it was, how it affects every aspect of life." Marcus nodded, a hint of appreciation in his eyes. "That's the thing, Mike. For people like me, it's not just about one incident. It's a lifetime of incidents, big and small, that wear you down over time." As their coffee grew cold, forgotten in the intensity of their discussion, both men found themselves sharing personal stories. Marcus talked about his journey as a black entrepreneur, the additional hurdles he had to overcome, the constant need to prove himself in rooms full of skeptical white faces. Mike, in turn, opened up about his struggles as a single father, his fears of not being able to provide for his daughter, and how those fears had sometimes manifested as over-aggressive behavior in his job. As their conversation drew to a close, both men felt a shift in the air between them. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was understanding. A bridge had been built, tentative and fragile, but a starting point nonetheless. Marcus stood, extending his hand to Mike. "This was enlightening, Mike. I appreciate your willingness to have this difficult conversation." Mike shook Marcus's hand, his grip firm. "Thank you for giving me this chance, Mr. Johnson. I know I have a lot more work to do, but I'm committed to doing it." As they parted ways outside the cafe, both men felt the weight of the conversation they had just had. For Marcus, it was a reminder of the complexity of human nature, of the possibility for growth and change. For Mike, it was a reaffirmation of his commitment to be better, to do better. They walked away in opposite directions, each lost in thought about the path forward. The incident that had brought them together had been a catalyst for change, not just for them, but for an entire community. And while the road ahead was long and challenging, both men felt a cautious optimism about the future they were working to create. The weeks following the meeting between Marcus and Mike saw a flurry of activity at Greenview Mall. True to his word, Marcus had initiated a comprehensive overhaul of the mall's policies and practices, with a focus on promoting diversity, equity, and inclusion. In a spacious conference room, Marcus stood before a diverse group of mall employees, from security guards to retail workers to management staff. The atmosphere was a mix of anticipation and nervousness as Marcus introduced the new sensitivity training program. "Good morning, everyone," Marcus began, his voice carrying a note of determination. "Today marks the beginning of an important journey for all of us. The incident that occurred here wasn't just about one person's actions. It exposed systemic issues that we need to address head-on." As Marcus outlined the program, which included workshops on unconscious bias, cultural competency, and de-escalation techniques, he could see a range of reactions in the room. Some employees leaned forward, eager to learn. Others shifted uncomfortably, perhaps feeling defensive or skeptical. Mike, sitting in the front row, listened intently. He had volunteered to be part of the first group to undergo the training, seeing it as an opportunity to continue his personal growth and to set an example for his colleagues. As the training progressed over the next few days, participants engaged in role-playing exercises, group discussions, and self-reflection activities. They grappled with difficult topics, confronting their own biases, and learning to see situations from different perspectives. During one particularly intense session, a heated debate broke out between two security guards. One defended the old way of doing things, arguing that profiling was sometimes necessary for safety. The other, inspired by Mike's journey, pushed back, emphasizing the harm caused by such practices. Marcus watched the exchange, allowing it to unfold without intervention. He knew that these uncomfortable conversations were crucial for real change to occur. Meanwhile, Emma had taken her activism beyond the protest. Inspired by the changes happening at the mall, she and her friends had started a diversity and inclusion club at their high school. They organized workshops, invited guest speakers, and worked to create a more inclusive environment for all students. One afternoon, Emma invited her father to speak at one of their club meetings. Mike, nervous but determined, shared his story with the students. He spoke about his mistake, the lessons he had learned, and the ongoing process of educating himself and changing his behavior. "It's not easy to admit when you're wrong," Mike told the attentive group of teenagers. "But it's necessary if we want to grow and make our community better. I'm still learning every day, and I'm committed to doing better." The students listened respectfully, and after Mike's talk, they engaged in a thoughtful discussion about personal responsibility, systemic racism, and the role of education in creating change. Back at the mall, the effects of the new policies were beginning to show. The security team, now more diverse and better trained, approached their duties with a new awareness. Customers noticed the change, with several commenting on the more welcoming atmosphere. Marcus, walking through the mall one day, overheard a conversation between two shoppers of color. "You know," one said to the other, "I actually feel comfortable here now, like I'm not being watched every second." The comment brought a small smile to Marcus's face. It was a small victory, but an important one. As part of the mall's new community outreach efforts, they had partnered with local minority-owned businesses, offering them spaces at reduced rates. The initiative had brought a new vibrancy to the mall, with unique shops and eateries drawing diverse crowds. One evening, as Marcus was leaving his office, he ran into Mike, who was just starting his shift. There was a moment of awkwardness before Mike spoke up. "Mr. Johnson," he said, "I just wanted to thank you again for this opportunity. The training, the changes, it's really opened my eyes. I know we still have a long way to go, but I'm grateful to be part of this process." Marcus nodded, a hint of warmth in his eyes. "I appreciate that, Mike. Change isn't easy, but it's necessary. Keep up the good work." As Marcus walked away, he felt a sense of cautious optimism. The incident that had started this journey had been painful, but it had sparked a transformation that was rippling out beyond the walls of the mall. He knew there would be more challenges ahead. Change was never a smooth or easy process, but as he looked around at the bustling mall, at the diverse faces of shoppers and employees alike, Marcus felt a renewed determination. They were on the right path, and he was committed to seeing it through. The mall, once a site of conflict and pain, was slowly becoming a model for what a truly inclusive community space could look like. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. And for now, that was enough to keep Marcus, Mike, and all those involved in this journey moving forward, one step at a time. The grand atrium of Greenview Mall was packed to capacity. A sea of faces turned expectantly towards the makeshift stage. Banners proclaiming a new era of inclusion hung from the railings of the upper levels. The launch of the mall's comprehensive sensitivity training program had drawn significant attention, not just from employees and regular shoppers, but from community leaders, activists, and media outlets as well. Marcus Johnson stood at the podium, surveying the crowd. He could feel the weight of expectation in the air, the hope for real change mixed with skepticism, born from years of empty promises and performative actions. "Good morning, everyone," Marcus began, his voice steady and clear. "Today marks a significant milestone in our journey towards creating a truly inclusive environment here at Greenview Mall. But more than that, it represents our commitment to being a catalyst for change in our wider community." As Marcus outlined the details of the program, the extensive training modules, the revised security protocols, the community outreach initiatives, he could see a range of reactions in the crowd. There were nods of approval, thoughtful frowns, and even a few skeptical eye rolls. Halfway through his speech, a commotion erupted near the back of the atrium. A group of protesters had managed to slip past security, unfurling banners that read, "Too little, too late," and "Actions speak louder than words." The crowd's attention shifted, murmurs of discontent rippling through the gathering. Marcus paused, taking in the scene. This was the moment of truth, the test of whether the changes they'd implemented were more than just surface level. Before security could intervene, Marcus raised his hand. "Let them speak," he said, his voice firm but calm. "They have a right to be heard." A hush fell over the crowd as a young woman from the protest group stepped forward. "Fine words and fancy programs are all well and good," she called out, her voice passionate. "But how do we know this isn't just a PR stunt? How can we trust that real change will happen?" Marcus nodded, acknowledging her point. "You're right to be skeptical," he replied. "Words alone are not enough. That's why we're not just talking about change, we're implementing it. But more importantly, we're opening ourselves up to be held accountable." He gestured to the side of the stage, where Mike stood with a group of other employees who had undergone the training. "We're not hiding from our mistakes. We're confronting them head-on and doing the hard work of changing ingrained behaviors and systems." Mike stepped forward, visibly nervous but determined. "I was the one who made the mistake that started all this," he said, his voice shaky at first but growing stronger. "I'm here today not to make excuses, but to show that people can change, that we can learn and do better." As Mike shared his experience of going through the training, of confronting his own biases and working to overcome them, the atmosphere in the atrium began to shift. The protesters lowered their banners, listening intently. Marcus returned to the podium. "We know we haven't gotten everything right. We know there's still a long way to go. But we're committed to this journey, and we invite all of you, especially those who are skeptical, to be part of it. Hold us accountable. Challenge us when we fall short. Help us build the kind of community we all want to see." As he finished speaking, there was a moment of silence. Then, slowly, applause began to build. It wasn't universal. There were still pockets of skepticism, but it was genuine. The young protester who had spoken earlier approached the stage. "We'll be watching," she said, her tone less confrontational now. "We want to believe in this change, but you'll have to prove it's real." Marcus nodded, extending his hand. "I wouldn't have it any other way." As the event wound down, Marcus found himself surrounded by a mix of supporters and critics, all eager to share their thoughts on the program. He listened to each one, taking mental notes, already thinking about how to incorporate their feedback. Off to the side, Mike stood with his daughter Emma, who had come to support him. "You did good, Dad," she said, squeezing his hand. Mike smiled, a mix of pride and humility on his face. "We've still got a long way to go," he replied, "but we're on the right path." As the crowd dispersed, Marcus took a final look around the atrium. The incident that had started as a personal humiliation had turned into something much bigger, a catalyst for change that was rippling out beyond the walls of the mall. He knew the road ahead would be challenging. Change was never easy, and there would be setbacks along the way. But as he watched the diverse group of people leaving the mall, talking, debating, engaging with each other, Marcus felt a sense of hope. The mall, once just a place for shopping, had become a crucible for social change, a microcosm of the larger societal shifts happening around them. And while the future was uncertain, one thing was clear. The conversation had started, and there was no going back.